The insult didn't arrive as a shout. It came as a cool breath over crystal and china, as if it belonged with the silver. "You are a nobody," my mother said, and the chandelier light trembled across her pearl earrings. Somewhere down the table, my father tapped a spoon against porcelain, not looking up. James leaned back, half smiling, and added, "Honestly, we forget you exist half the time." 2 sentences just like that, loud enough to be heard above the soft hiss of the dining room vents and the knife gliding through beef Wellington. My glass stood perfectly still. My hands did not. I pressed my fingers flat against the linen, felt the weave, and tried to remember how to breathe. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, hit the like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next chapter. To understand how that dinner changed everything, you need to know how vanishing became a habit long before the salad course. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, in a colonial with white trim and a front walk that looked like a magazine cover every spring. My mother, Eleanor, ran our house like a stage set, garden beds, weeded by sunrise table runners, ironed napkin rings polished for charity luncheons. My father, Dr. Richard Sullivan, wore his authority like a well-cut coat. Patients adored him. In the house, he moved from medical journals to phone calls with a kind of sacred urgency. Interrupting him felt like stepping into an operating room ungloved. James, 3 years older, had a grin that could turn a room his way. Lacrosse captain. Early decision to Harvard. The kind of son who collects applause the way other boys collect ticket stubs. When people asked about the Sullivan kids, my parents answered as if there were one child with 2 names. "Our son James," they'd say, teeth bright under porch lights. If I was mentioned, it was the way you'd mention the weather after a big game, polite, brief, and largely ignored. I didn't start out quiet. I learned it. On my 10th birthday, I came downstairs in a yellow dress and patent leather shoes, cheeks warm with excitement. Balloons waited in the mudroom. I could smell the cake Maria, our housekeeper, had promised to frost. Instead, the kitchen was empty. The living room was empty. The only sound was the dishwasher humming and a game announcer talking through a radio left on low. Maria looked at me as if she wished she could change the air. "They took James to his tournament in Connecticut," she said, gentle and ashamed. "They left at dawn. My invitations, the ones I'd handed out at school with careful smiles, had nowhere to lead. We wrapped the cake in plastic that night and slid it into the refrigerator. It tasted like cold sugar the next day, eaten standing up. Something shifted then. A door quietly shut inside me, and I found another smaller room where it was safer to stay. I learned to sit in corners at family gatherings where the ficus plant could hide me. I learned the speed of a nod, the volume of a helpful voice, the art of offering to take the photo so I wouldn't have to be in it. When relatives asked about school, my mother floated a bridge to James's new medal, James's new internship, James's new whatever. Conversation moved like a river that refused my shore. Photography arrived like an honest friend who doesn't talk very much. A used camera, a second-hand strap. And the first time I brought the viewfinder to my eye, the world stopped shoving. I could choose what filled the frame. I could decide what mattered. Miss Abrams entered my prints in a statewide contest without telling me, then clapped so hard when I won that the principal turned in surprise. At home, my father looked up from the paper long enough to say, "That's nice," the way you might acknowledge a weather report. My mother smiled and called it a sweet hobby, something for weekends after I'd chosen a proper field. By the time college applications rolled around, I had built a private practice in the small rituals of vanishing. I kept a 4.0 without mentioning it. I folded laundry in the laundry room while guests praised James. When I chose NYU's Tisch School for Photography, my father blinked hard. "Not Harvard?" he asked. My mother tilted her head as if I'd misheard the question and might still correct my answer. New York, though, New York had a way of holding your face in both hands and saying, "Look at me." I found a pair of roommates with loud laughs and open hearts, a professor who loved the way my shadow spoke, and a stretch of Brooklyn street where I could walk after sunset and feel the city breathe with me. I met Michael at a gallery show crowded with glass and voices. He asked why I photographed not what. I told him about dignity in ordinary light. He said he recognized the feeling. Back home, the monthly dinners remained scheduled like dental cleanings marked the calendar brace for the chair. The house never changed. The scent of lemon oil on the banister, the long table in the formal dining room set with heirloom silver my mother polished like armor. At those meals, I practiced the choreography of shrinking. Shoulders slightly rounded, voice 2 notches softer than usual, a smile that said, "I don't take up much room." When I mentioned that a small Soho gallery was showing my series, the conversation turned mid-sentence toward James's presentation at a medical conference. When I called to share that Michael had proposed by a glassy lake in the Catskills, no grand gestures, just a ring whose vintage setting looked like it had remembered love before. My mother asked the carat size as if she were checking the weather, then compared it to what James might purchase for a surgeon's daughter. 2 weeks later, the gallery opening was standing room only. Friends pressed my hands. A professor wiped at the corner of his eye. 7 pieces sold that night. On the way home, we bought late pizza, and I laughed so hard in the kitchen I had to sit down. I mailed my parents formal invitations and a copy of the Artscope feature that called my work Quiet Power. The magazine disappeared into their mailbox as if the slot led to a time before I had been born. I kept showing up. Habit is a kind of gravity. I drove down for dinner with a bottle of good red and a dress I'd worn to the opening, the hem freshly steamed. Michael asked if I wanted him with me. I told him I did. I told him I didn't. In the driveway, he squeezed my hand and said he'd be there if I changed my mind. The house had that Sunday hush. It always had television muted in my father's study, classical music whispering from a speaker in the living room, my mother's perfume woven into the air like thread. She opened the door wearing a cashmere sweater and a look that scanned. Her eyes paused on my dress, then moved on. I smelled beef and pastry. She had made Wellington again, the one dish I'd stopped eating 3 years ago. "Oh, the vegetarian thing," she said when I mentioned it breezy as paper. "There are potatoes." We sat. The first course arrived in white bowls. My father talked about a new hospital wing as if he were narrating a map. My mother described the charity gala menu and the floral budget like a general tallying munitions. James spoke about a difficult diagnosis he'd nailed on a Thursday after midnight, and they leaned in. I tried to drop my news into the space between sentences Westbrook Gallery had invited me to exhibit in the spring. The magazine had sent a photographer to shoot my studio. Michael and I were thinking September for the wedding, but each time their attention pivoted like a weather vane turning toward a familiar wind. The injustice in my family wasn't a single act. It was layered like paint on an old banister one winter after another. It was the expectant silence that followed my words, the smile that froze on my mother's mouth when my sentence didn't end with my brother's name. It was the way my father's praise came only in the shape of a question about how stable my field was. It was the way my chair felt an inch shorter than the rest. By dessert, I had convinced myself this evening would end like all the others. Creme brulee cracked under spoons. The chandelier hummed softly. The vents kept whispering a patient central song. The conversation paused. The pause widened. Pause? I cleared my throat, not loudly. "I got confirmation this morning," I said. "The Westbrook in Soho is giving me a spring exhibition. It's the kind of chance I stopped. The table was listening. My father looked up. James's fork hovered. My mother's gaze sharpened a degree the way it does when she's about to ask the caterer for something no one else can taste. Then she said at I's steady voice, smooth as a lake's surface in old photographs. Letty, do you really think anyone cares about your little hobby? You are a nobody. Don't pretend you matter. It wasn't even cruel in her mouth. It was tidy like folding a napkin. James exhaled a laugh he must have thought would soften the blow. Honestly, he said, we forget. You exist half the time. The room did not tilt. I had always imagined that a moment like this would upend the floor, knock the glasses together, throw everything into chaos. Instead, the chandelier kept shining. The silver kept shining. Somewhere in the vent, a thread of air kept traveling from one room to another, keeping the house comfortable. I pressed my palms to the linen and felt the starch resist. My heart beat too fast. My breath arrived too shallow. My tongue found the edge of a tooth, as if it were a shoreline. The easiest thing would have been to let the moment pass. I knew how to do that. Someone would mention a conference in London. Someone would ask if anyone wanted more coffee. The insult would sink like a stone under a tablecloth heavy, but hidden, and by morning the fabric would look smooth again. Instead, I noticed details I had never noticed at that table. The fine crack in my mother's wine glass, a hair of light running down the bowl. The slight tremor in my father's right hand, the one that disappeared in the OR. The faint crease in James's forehead he got when a joke didn't land. The way Amanda's napkin had been twisted to a rope tight in her lap. I saw the table as a photograph I had not yet taken, every element balanced, every truth collecting in the light. Family is family. James might have said next if I'd given him time. My mother might have smoothed her napkin and asked about seating charts. My father might have suggested we not get emotional, as if emotion were a spill you could blot. But in the quiet, after those 2 sentences, all the birthdays and report cards and edges of rooms I had chosen for safety crowded into the space around my plate and stood there breathing with me. I didn't stand. I didn't speak. Not yet. I felt the fork's weight in my hand and set it down so lightly the sound barely rose above the air. And in the hush that followed, I understood that the next thing I did would belong to me and nobody else. Outside the dining room, the porch light glowed against the fall dark. In the hall, the clock ticked its old patient measure. I lifted my water glass, watched the surface hold steady, and told myself one true thing: I would not disappear this time. Michael drove us home that night with one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly over mine. The road stretched ahead in long, dark ribbons, the headlights cutting through an October fog that seemed to follow us out of my parents' neighborhood. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence felt different from the kind that used to hang at my family table. It wasn't cold or punishing. It was the kind of quiet that comes when everything has been said, but nothing has settled yet. I watched the trees blur by and waited for the tears I thought would come. Instead, there was only an ache, slow and deep somewhere behind my ribs. I kept replaying my mother's words, her tone so even it could have been mistaken for good manners. The shock had dulled into a heaviness I couldn't shake. When Michael finally asked if I was all right, I nodded out of habit, then caught myself. No, I said softly. But I will be. When we reached our apartment, he unlocked the door and waited as I stepped inside. The familiar scent of coffee and books met me warm and human after that museum-like house. I slipped off my shoes and stood by the window, watching the city lights tremble against the glass. Below, someone laughed too loudly on the sidewalk, the kind of carefree sound that belonged to people who weren't unraveling. Michael came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders, his chin brushing my hair. "You don't have to talk tonight," he murmured. "Just breathe." For the first time in years, I allowed someone to see the exhaustion I usually kept hidden. My body trembled not from fear, but from release. I realized I had been holding myself upright through dinner the way a building holds through an earthquake, pretending it isn't falling apart. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, tracing the ceiling shadows, hearing my mother's words echo, and trying to find a version of myself that didn't belong to her disappointment. By morning, sunlight pooled across the hardwood floor. Michael handed me a cup of coffee before leaving for work, kissed my forehead, and said, "Take the day." I did. I stayed in my robe, let my phone buzz unanswered, and sat at my desk surrounded by contact sheets from the last exhibit. The photographs looked back at me like witnesses. People in alleys, on benches, in subways, all the invisible lives I had tried to honor through my lens. And I wondered if I had spent my whole career photographing pieces of myself. That week, the calls began. My mother left a single message that started with, "We need to talk about your behavior," and ended with a click. My father sent a short text asking me to call when I had calmed down. James wrote twice first, a defensive note, then something softer. I read each message, then closed my phone and set it face down. For once, I didn't rush to explain or apologize. I needed to let the quiet speak before I did. 3 days later, I sat across from Dr. Laura in her office, the one with soft lighting and a window that looked out on a line of ginkgo trees. The smell of tea drifted faintly from her desk. She listened as I described the dinner, the words, the silence, the strange calm that had come over me after. "It sounds like clarity," she said when I finished. "Painful, but clarifying." I told her I felt both lighter and lost. She smiled gently. "That's what happens when you stop carrying someone else's expectations. It takes a little while to remember your own shape." We talked about boundaries, about how love without respect isn't actually love, and about the fear that comes from stepping outside old roles. "You are the invisible one," she said, "but invisibility can be unlearned." Her words landed quietly like stones placed in a foundation I didn't know I was rebuilding. Days passed. I returned to my studio, developing new negative spaces caught in the in-between moments of city life. A man waiting under an overpass. A woman looking through a store window at clothes she couldn't afford. Their expressions mirrored something I felt but couldn't name. Each frame steadied me, a reminder that invisibility doesn't mean absence. It means waiting to be seen. The following weekend, I met with Lisa and Jasmine for lunch at a cafe near the river. They had both been at the gallery opening, had seen the joy on my face that night before the emptiness set in. Jasmine reached across the table, touching my hand lightly. "You look like you'd stepped out of a shadow," she said. "Don't go back in." I smiled, unsure how to promise that. Lisa, ever the filmmaker, had a sharper take. "Your mom's comment, it's the last scene in one movie and the first scene in another." I wanted to believe that, but it felt too soon. When Michael came home that evening, he found me sorting through photos on the living room floor. He sat beside me, crossing his legs, studying the images. "You see people others overlook," he said quietly. "Maybe that's because you know what it's like." I nodded. "I think I've spent my whole life trying to prove I exist." He tilted his head. And now, I looked at him and said, "Now I just want to live it." Still, the quiet between me and my family felt unfinished. A week later, I opened my phone and reread James's latest message. He'd written, "Maybe we should talk, just us." I didn't mean what I said at dinner. Something in his tone felt unsteady, almost honest. I told him I'd think about it. My father's messages had stopped after the second one. My mother predictably sent a long text about how families shouldn't air drama in front of guests. I didn't respond. "In therapy, doctor," Laura asked what it would look like if I stopped waiting for their approval entirely. The question sat in my chest for days. Approval had always been the air I breathed, thin, unreliable, but familiar. What filled the space when it was gone, I started to find out. Without the constant tug of family expectations, I noticed small changes. My mornings felt wider. I cooked breakfast without checking the time. I stopped composing imaginary conversations in my head before every phone call. I said yes to photographing a new project, a documentary series on overlooked communities in the city, and felt a spark I hadn't felt in years. But progress is never a straight line. Some nights, guilt crept in quietly. I'd wake thinking of my father's face as I left the table, or my mother's narrowed eyes when I said those 3 sentences. The old fear returned. Maybe I'd gone too far. Michael would reach for me half asleep, and I'd whisper that I was fine. He never believed me. But he let the silence hold us anyway. 2 weeks after the dinner, an envelope arrived. My parents' handwriting on the front. Inside a photograph, one of the few family portraits ever taken years ago in the garden. James stood in front, beaming. My parents framed around him. I was half behind a hedge, the corner of my face barely visible. No note, no explanation. I stared at it for a long time before tucking it into a drawer. It felt like a message without words, a reminder of my place, or maybe an unconscious confession of what they'd done all along. That night, I dreamed of the dining room table, only this time the chairs were empty. The chandelier flickered, and light fell in uneven pools across the plates. When I woke, my chest ached with both grief and relief. The dream hadn't scared me, it had freed me. Michael found me at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea and asked what was wrong. Nothing, I said. Everything. He smiled softly. That sounds like change. Change came in quiet increments. A morning spent in the park photographing strangers who laughed without permission. A call with Diane, the gallery owner, who wanted to feature my next series. Her confidence in me filled a space my family never had. Your work has grown, she said. There's more truth in it now. I hung up and stood at the window watching clouds drift past the rooftops, realizing she was right. The truth had cost me comfort, but it had given me voice. When James called again, I answered. His voice was low, tentative. I wanted to say, I'm sorry, he said. For what I said at dinner. For a lot of things. I waited, letting him fill the silence. I never saw it from your side, he continued. Mom and Dad made it easy not to. You were just quiet. I didn't realize quiet could mean hurt. I felt my throat tighten. I appreciate you saying that, I said, but it's not something we fix in one call. He agreed. We decided to meet halfway between Boston and New York sometime soon. When I hung up, I felt something small but unmistakable. A door, opening not fully, but enough for light to pass through. My father wrote next, a short email with no greeting. I have your magazine article in my desk drawer. I'm proud of the work you're doing. That was all. I read it twice, wondering if it had taken him all night to find those words. I didn't reply immediately. I let them sit, knowing their simplicity was more than he'd ever offered before. Through all of it, my mother remained silent, except for a single message asking whether I planned to attend the next family dinner. I typed, then deleted a dozen replies before settling on one line, not for now. I hit send and felt the same calm I'd felt when I left her house, the kind that comes when you finally stop asking for what someone refuses to give. Winter arrived early that year. Snow collected along the fire escape, softening the noise of the street below. I spent evenings editing photos and listening to the quiet hum of our apartment. Sometimes Michael would read aloud from his notebook words about belonging, about seeing. We didn't talk about my family much, but he knew when my mind drifted there. You did the hardest thing, he said one night. You told the truth. I thought about that as the radiator clicked and the city sighed outside. The truth, I realized, was not a weapon, it was a light. It didn't destroy what it touched. It revealed it. By February, I felt steady enough to accept Diane's invitation for a spring show. The series would be called Scene. Each photograph would capture someone, overlooked faces in laundromats, subway musicians, elderly couples on stoops. I wanted it to say what I hadn't been able to say at that dinner table, that presence is power, that being seen is a kind of love. On the morning I signed the gallery contract, a beam of light fell across my workspace, striking the framed photo from years ago, the family one, where I was half hidden. I took it out of the drawer, studied it for a long moment, then slipped it into a folder labeled Inspiration. Not as a wound, but as a beginning. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, but I felt the tempo shift inside me. For the first time, I wasn't hurrying to catch up or stay small. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And though part of me still ached for something, I'd never had another part quiet. Certain knew the next chapter would be written on my terms. The first signs of spring arrived quietly, the kind that only people who've lived through long winters notice. The air lost its sharp edge, and the snow along the sidewalks melted into thin rivers that caught the afternoon light. I spent most mornings in my studio, the windows cracked just enough to let in the cool air, the walls pinned with prints from my new series. Faces of strangers' hands caught mid-motion, lives framed in moments no one else had stopped to see. Each photograph felt like a breath of clarity. I wasn't chasing approval anymore, just truth. But truth, I was learning, has a way of echoing back into places you thought you'd already left behind. One afternoon, as I adjusted the light stand near my desk, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I let it ring, assuming it was a gallery contact, until a voice on the voicemail made me stop mid-step. It was my father. His tone was careful, almost hesitant. He said he'd be in New York for a medical conference and wondered if I'd like to meet for lunch. For a long time, I stood still, the message replaying in my mind. My father wasn't a man who asked for anything twice. His words, even gentle ones, always carried an edge of control. But something in his tone this time, an uncertainty I had never heard, made me agree. We met at a quiet restaurant near Bryant Park. He arrived exactly on time, his suit pressed, his hands folded neatly on the table. Age had softened the lines around his eyes, but not the composure. I ordered tea. He ordered black coffee. For several minutes, neither of us said much. Finally, he spoke. I read that article about your exhibit. I have it in my desk. He said it like a confession, not an accomplishment. Your mother doesn't quite understand the art world, but I thought the photographs were powerful. It took me a moment to respond. Hearing pride from him, even in measured form, felt foreign, like sunlight through blinds after a lifetime of gray. Thank you, I said quietly. He nodded, stirring his coffee, though he hadn't added anything to it. You always had a good eye. I used to take photos in college. Did I ever tell you that? I shook my head. No, you didn't. He smiled faintly. Medicine took over, I suppose, but I still have the old Nikon. Maybe I'll dig it out sometime. For a brief moment, we talked like two people trying to build a bridge from opposite sides of a river. He asked about Michael, about the wedding plans, and even managed a small laugh when I told him the florist had tried to upsell us into a jungle. Beneath it all, though, I could feel the silence waiting, everything unsaid between us. When the check came, he reached for it automatically, then paused. You don't have to let the past decide what comes next, he said. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing he knew how to give. As we parted outside, the wind lifted his gray hair slightly. For once, He didn't look like a man above feeling. "Take care of yourself, Letty," he said. I watched him cross the street, the city crowd closing around him until he disappeared into it. That evening, I told Michael about the meeting while we cooked dinner. He listened without interrupting, slicing onions carefully, the way he always did when he knew I needed space. "It sounds like he's trying," he said, "in his way." I nodded. "Maybe, but I'm not sure what I want from trying anymore." He set down the knife, wiped his hands, and looked at me. "Then maybe it's not about what you want from them. Maybe it's about what you'll allow back into your peace." His words stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, small gestures from my family began to surface: postcards, brief texts, even a package from my mother that arrived without a note. Inside was one of my early photographs framed in silver. It was a picture I'd taken at 17 of an empty park bench, under winter light, a study in loneliness. I wasn't sure if she meant it as acknowledgement or irony, but I placed it on the shelf anyway. Sometimes, progress arrives in imperfect packages. James called a week later. He sounded different, slower, thoughtful. "I've been in therapy," he said, as if bracing for my reaction. "It's strange hearing yourself say things you didn't know were inside you." I smiled faintly. "It can be." He told me he'd started questioning the pressure he'd carried his whole life, the expectations from our parents, the constant comparisons. "I used to think being the golden child was a reward," he said. "Now it feels more like a job I never applied for." We decided to meet halfway at a cafe in Connecticut that sat beside a quiet lake. When I arrived, he was already there, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. He stood unsure whether to hug me. I saved him the decision. The conversation was awkward at first. We talked about work weather, meaningless things. Then slowly it shifted. He told me about panic attacks he'd been hiding during his residency, how perfection had become a cage. "You were always calmer," he said. "I thought that meant you didn't care. Now I know it was just survival." I looked at him, really looked, and saw someone trying to peel back layers that had never belonged to him. "We were both just trying to earn love," I said. "You by shining, me by disappearing." He nodded, eyes bright in the pale light off the water. "Maybe we can stop trying," he said. When I drove home that evening, I felt lighter. The road curved through small towns where porch lights glowed against the dusk, and for the first time, I didn't feel the old ache of being unseen. The world itself felt wide enough for both of us. By the time my exhibition scene opened, that May something inside me had shifted. The gallery filled with people, friends, colleagues, strangers drawn by the photographs. I walked among them quietly, hearing murmured reactions, catching bits of wonder. Each image hung like a story without words. Michael squeezed my hand as the gallery owner, Diane, introduced me to a journalist from The New Yorker. "Your work gives silence a language," he said. I smiled, grateful that my silence had finally found meaning. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, I noticed my father standing near the back. He looked slightly out of place, holding a glass of water instead of wine. When our eyes met, he raised the glass in a small gesture of acknowledgement. My mother wasn't there, but that night, I didn't need her to be. After the closing, we walked along the city street toward home. Michael's hand brushed mine, our steps easy. "You look different," he said. "Peaceful." "I feel seen," I told him. Maybe for the first time. Summer arrived with the scent of rain on hot pavement. Life took on a rhythm that felt steady work laughter plans for the wedding. Yet healing doesn't erase the past. It reframes it. There were still nights when I dreamed of my mother's voice, or days when a familiar song on the radio pulled me back into that dining room. But now those memories no longer defined me. They were simply part of the landscape I'd walked through to reach this place. In July, a card arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside, in my mother's handwriting, were were 6 words. Your photographs are something worth seeing. No signature, no punctuation, just that. I traced the letters with my thumb and placed the card beside the framed photo she'd sent before. It was a beginning, fragile but real. That weekend I met James for dinner in the city. He told me he was leaving surgery to pursue psychiatry. I want to help people find what I'm still figuring out, he said. He looked nervous, but freer. Mom doesn't understand, he added with a small laugh. But that's okay. I don't need her to. We toasted with iced tea, and I told him I was proud of him. As we said goodbye, he hugged me tightly. You taught me more than you know, he whispered. I drove home smiling, knowing that some cycles end not with confrontation, but with compassion. That night, I developed a new role of film portraits of elderly residents at a community center I'd been photographing. In their eyes, I saw a kind of endurance that mirrored my own. Each image glowed softly under the darkroom light, and I felt gratitude, not for what I'd endured, but for what I'd learned from it. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, a summer storm moving through. I turned off the light, listening to the rain begin against the windows. For years, I had lived waiting for recognition from those who refused to see. Now the recognition came from within, quiet and certain. I no longer needed to shrink to fit anyone's view. When Michael came in damp from the rain, he found me leaning against the window frame, watching lightning bloom over the skyline. Thinking again, he asked gently. Always, I said. But it feels different now. He wrapped his arms around me, and we stood there in silence, the city breathing below us. The storm outside softened to a whisper, and somewhere in that stillness, I felt the faint promise of something new, an understanding that healing wasn't a destination, but a practice. The next morning, I woke early and began sketching ideas for a new series. The working title was Origins. I wanted it to explore how people rebuild from what breaks them. I smiled at the thought, realizing that maybe this time, I wasn't just documenting others, I was finally capturing myself. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt enough. A year after that stormy summer night, life had begun to move with a quiet rhythm I hadn't known before. Mornings started with coffee and soft music while sunlight crept across the kitchen tiles. The wedding planning had taken on a calm, intentional pace, no grand gestures, no lists of who needed impressing. Just 2 people choosing how they wanted to be seen, and more importantly, how they wanted to live. The gallery series Scene was still traveling now, showing in San Francisco. I spent my days preparing prints for a new project, answering interviews, and mentoring young photographers through a local arts foundation. My workdays used to feel like a climb toward recognition. Now they felt like quiet proof that I had built something real, something mine. Then one afternoon, in early April, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender's name stopped me. Eleanor Sullivan. The subject line read simply, Dinner. For a moment, my breath caught the way it used to when I'd opened their front door as a child, unsure what waited behind it. Her message was brief, formal, almost clinical. She asked if Michael and I would join them for Easter Sunday dinner, a small family gathering, nothing elaborate. She added that she'd understand if we declined. I read it twice before forwarding it to Michael. He looked up from his desk and studied me carefully. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to delete it. Another part. I trailed off, unsure if what I felt was curiosity or the ache of unfinished things. He nodded. If you go, make sure you're going as yourself. Not who they still expect you to be. That night, I sat by the window with my laptop open but untouched. Outside, rain slicked the streetlights, turning them into soft pools of gold. My reflection looked older, somehow steadier. I thought about James, about the work he was doing in psychiatry, about how he'd found his footing on ground that once felt like quicksand. Maybe it was time to test my own. So I replied, "We'll come for dinner. 2 hours, if things stay respectful." Easter arrived bright and mild, the kind of spring day that feels almost rehearsed. The drive to Brookline was familiar, but not heavy. The house appeared exactly as it always had, manicured, symmetrical, the porch urns already filled with fresh lilies. My stomach tightened as we walked up the steps, but Michael's hand brushed mine, grounding me. My mother opened the door. Her hair was shorter now, silver at the edges. She wore a soft blue sweater instead of her usual pearls. "You look well," she said. It wasn't affection, but it wasn't dismissal either. That small difference mattered. The dining room looked unchanged, but there were new details: a vegetarian dish among the roasts, a second vase of tulips near my place setting. Small gestures, but deliberate ones. My father greeted Michael warmly, even poured him a glass of wine. James and Amanda were there too, their laughter easy and genuine. Dinner began quietly. For a while, conversation stayed safe. James's new practice, Michael's latest short story, a mention of my exhibition in passing. My mother didn't interrupt or redirect. She just listened, hands folded neatly on the tablecloth. When dessert arrived, she looked at me across the table. "I saw the feature about your community project," she said. It was thoughtful. The pause that followed felt enormous. In another time, I would have rushed to fill it to make her comfortable. Instead, I let it rest. "Thank you," I said simply. Later, when we stood in the garden, she joined me by the tulip beds. The air carried that faint sweetness of early bloom and wet soil. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Your father tells me you've found success. I suppose I didn't realize how much that world mattered to you." "It matters because I made it," I said softly. "It's not about the recognition." She nodded, the lines around her eyes deepening. "You were always different. I didn't know how to understand that. I could feel something shift in the space between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement." "You didn't have to understand it," I replied. "You just had to see it." Her eyes glistened, though she didn't cry. "I'm trying," she said quietly. That was all. But it was enough. When we left that night, my father pressed a small envelope into my hand. "For your next show," he said. Inside was a short handwritten note and a check made out to the Youth Arts Foundation I'd been supporting. I thanked him, knowing the gesture meant more than words. The following months passed with a soft kind of momentum. James and I spoke often, sometimes meeting in the city for lunch. He was thriving in his new role, lighter than I'd ever seen him. My father sent an occasional text, small updates about travel or a new camera lens he'd rediscovered. My mother remained cautious but consistent, sending photographs of the garden or a recipe she thought I'd like. None of it was dramatic, but each message felt like a stone laid on a fragile bridge we were learning to cross. Michael and I married that October in a small garden ceremony surrounded by friends and the quiet hum of autumn. The air smelled of cedar and rain. My dress was simple ivory silk, with a faint shimmer when the light caught it. We exchanged vows under an arch of wildflowers, promising to build a life grounded in truth and presence. When the ceremony ended, I noticed my parents standing together near the edge of the crowd. My mother held a small bouquet of lavender, her face unreadable but calm. My father gave a restrained wave, the kind that said more than any speech could. And beside them, James grinned, holding a camera I'd loaned him years before. He caught a photo of us as we turned toward each other, unposed, laughing, utterly unguarded. The reception lasted well into evening. Lanterns glowed in the trees, their light soft and forgiving. Michael and I danced barefoot on the grass, the sound of a cello rising from the small band nearby. Around us, people talked and laughed and toasted. There were no speeches about family legacy or expectations, no performances. Just the steady rhythm of a night built on peace. Later, when the guests had gone and the house was still, I sat by the window in the borrowed farmhouse we'd rented for the weekend. The moon hung low over the fields, silvering the fence line. I could hear Michael moving in the next room, his voice humming softly as he unpacked. My wedding ring caught the light, simple gold, no diamonds, and for the first time, it felt like the weight on my hand matched the weight in my heart, steady, real, and chosen. In the quiet that followed, I thought about what Dr. Laura had told me during one of our last sessions. Healing, she said, isn't about erasing the past. It's about integrating it, letting it take up its rightful size and no more. I understood it now. My past would always be part of me, but it no longer decided who I was. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The field outside was covered in mist, and the world felt new in that clean, hushed way mornings sometimes do. I walked barefoot onto the porch, the boards cool under my feet. A single bird called from the distance, its song rising and falling like breath. Behind me, Michael opened the door and stood beside me, coffee in hand. "Happy first morning," he said with a sleepy smile. I leaned against him, my head resting on his shoulder. "It feels like peace." He nodded. "You earned it." We stood there as the light crept slowly across the horizon, touching the tops of the trees and the edges of our hands. I thought of the long road behind me, the years of silence, the sharp words at that dinner table, the ache of being unseen, and realized that every step had led me here. When we returned to Brooklyn, life found its rhythm again. My next exhibition, Origins, opened that winter, featuring portraits of people rebuilding their lives after loss. It became my most personal work, a quiet mirror of everything I'd learned. My parents attended the opening, standing in the back this time, saying little but staying until the end. My mother approached me afterward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your work makes people feel something," she said. "So does honesty," I replied. She nodded, her gaze steady, and for the first time, it felt like she saw me not as a daughter who disappointed her, but as a woman who had become whole on her own. That night, after the gallery closed, I walked through the empty space alone. The photographs glowed under soft light, each one a fragment of resilience. I paused in front of a self-portrait I had added at the last moment, me standing in a quiet alley, camera in hand, half in shadow, half in sunlight. I smiled at it, knowing that was exactly where I belonged. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the city in silence. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped into the cold air, ready for whatever came next. The night felt vast, but kind, the way it does when the story you've been living finally starts to feel like your own. The night after the gallery opening, snow kept falling soft and endless. By morning, the city looked hushed, as if someone had turned down the world's volume. I woke to that stillness, the kind that holds you gently before the day begins. The first light filtered through the window, pale gold against the curtain, and I felt the slow, steady rhythm of a life finally unhurried. Michael was already up, writing at the kitchen table. The faint scent of coffee and toasted bread drifted toward the bedroom. I could hear him humming under his breath, that low tune he made when words were coming easily. It was the kind of morning I used to imagine when life felt too heavy to picture peace. When I stepped into the kitchen, he looked up and smiled. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like I can finally exhale," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug he'd set out for me. The warmth seeped into my palms, anchoring me. Outside, flakes drifted lazily past the window, catching bits of early light. It looked like the world itself was pausing. The weeks that followed carried that same quiet rhythm. The exhibition traveled again, Chicago, London, then back to New York. Each time, new viewers came, and I listened as they spoke softly in front of the photographs, describing feelings that mirrored my own, from long ago, invisibility, endurance, small hopes hidden in ordinary moments. It moved me more than applause ever could. When Origins closed its final show, I felt no sadness, just completion. The art had done what it needed to do, give voice to people who rarely had one. And in doing so, it had finally given voice to me. One afternoon in early spring, my father called. He wanted to show me something. I met him at their house, though this time I didn't feel that familiar tightening in my chest. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. He led me to the study I had avoided for years, the one filled with journals and medical books. Now on the wall hung a grid of framed photographs, his own. Landscapes, still life, even a few portraits. He looked almost shy when he gestured toward them. "I dug out that old Nikon," he said. "It still works." I stepped closer to one photograph of their backyard just after rain. The grass glistened, every blade sharp with light. "It's beautiful," I told him, and I meant it. He smiled soft and genuine. "I guess you were right," he said. "There's art in what most people overlook." In that simple moment, a bridge formed, quiet, steady, built not from apology, but understanding. Later that afternoon, my mother joined us in the garden. The tulips were up again, brighter than the year before. She carried a tray of tea and sugar cookies, the same kind she used to serve at her charity meetings. But this time, she handed me the first cup. Her hands trembled just slightly. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice careful, "about how much I missed while I was busy trying to make everything perfect." The air between us stilled. Birds rustled somewhere in the branches above, and the faint sound of traffic hummed beyond the fence. "I can't rewrite it," she said after a pause. "But I'd like to see what's ahead, if you'll let me." I didn't rush my answer. "That's all I've ever wanted," I said finally. It wasn't forgiveness, not the cinematic kind. It was gentler, a mutual recognition that the past could rest without being erased. A few weeks later, Michael and I invited everyone to our Brooklyn apartment for dinner the first time our family had gathered under our roof. James arrived early, bringing homemade bread. He was relaxed, lighter, the way people look when they've stopped performing. My parents came together, holding a bottle of wine. My mother paused in the doorway, taking in the framed photographs on our walls, each one from a different series of mine. "You've made a beautiful home," she said. The evening passed easily. Conversation floated between laughter and small silences. My father spoke about his new photography hobby. My mother shared a story about volunteering at a local arts fundraiser, and James teased Michael about his endless notebooks. When the meal ended, no one hurried to leave. It was simple, ordinary, and extraordinary for exactly that reason. After everyone left, I stood by the window watching their car lights disappear into the city. Michael wrapped his arms around me from behind. "That went well," he whispered. "It did," I said. "Not perfect, but real." He nodded against my shoulder. "Real is better." Summer found its way back, and with it, a softer rhythm. I started teaching a weekly class at the community center, working with students who were learning photography for the first time. Many were older adults starting over after retirement or loss. Some were teenagers who hadn't yet found their footing. We spent afternoons walking through the city learning to notice light, how it touched brick, how it fell through trees, how it made even the smallest things worth looking at twice. One day, a student named Caroline, a widow in her 70s, showed me a photograph of her kitchen table, with sunlight spilling across a cup of tea. "I took this because it felt like company," she said. I smiled, knowing exactly what she meant. The class gave me more than I gave them. It reminded me that healing travels best when shared. At home, our lives stayed simple. Evenings filled with music and books, mornings with coffee and conversation. Some nights we sat by the window saying nothing at all, just listening to the hum of the city. Peace had once seemed like a distant horizon. Now, it lived in these small, steady moments. Every so often, I'd visit my parents in Brookline. My mother would show me her garden, proud of how the tulips kept returning. My father would point out a new photograph he'd taken, and I'd help him adjust the framing. We didn't talk about the past much. We didn't need to. The present was enough. One evening in late autumn, James and I met for coffee after one of his seminars. He looked content, the faint tiredness of someone who spends his days listening deeply to others. "You know," he said, stirring his cup, "when you spoke up that night at dinner, I thought you were ending everything. Turns out, you were just starting something new." I smiled. I didn't know it then either. We walked out into the cool air together, the city lights glinting on wet pavement. I felt gratitude, not the loud kind, but the quiet sort that lingers behind your ribs, for all the breaking and rebuilding, the leaving and returning, the silence, and the words finally spoken. That winter, I began a new project. It wasn't about invisibility anymore. It was about presence, the way light moves through the world when people choose to see it. I called the series Continuum. The images were softer this time, less about struggle and more about belonging. On the day I printed the final photograph, I stood in my studio as the afternoon sun angled across the floorboards. Dust hung in the light, each particle turning to gold for a breath before fading again. I thought about how years ago I would have rushed to capture that perfect glimmer before it vanished. Now, I just let it be. Peace, I realized, wasn't stillness or perfection. It was motion without panic light, without fear, love without needing to prove its worth. Outside, the sky deepened toward dusk, the city beginning to glow in shades of amber and violet. I turned off the lights, let the fading sun fill the room, and stood there quietly watching the last of it disappear. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive. They fade because we finally stop reopening them. What remains isn't absence, it's space. The kind you can breathe in. The kind where light finally gets through. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know how you found your own kind of peace. And if someone you know needs a reminder that healing can be quiet, share this with them. Thank you for spending this time with me. Wherever you are tonight, I hope the light finds you and stays a while.